The wind did not howl, it screamed. It was a living, predatory thing, a banshee of ice and fury clawing at the half-finished timbers of the cabin, seeking entry with a relentless, malicious patience. Each gust was a physical blow, shaking the crude structure to its very foundation and driving needle-fine splinters of snow through the gaps in the chinking. Inside, another storm raged, one of flesh and blood. Alara Vance cried out, her voice swallowed by the symphony of the blizzard. She was on the floor, on a bed of scratchy hay and old trade blankets, her back pressed against a wall that did little to stop the penetrating cold. A single sputtering tallow candle threw long dancing shadows that made the cramped space feel like a living tomb. The fire in the stone hearth had dwindled to a sullen orange glow, a dying heart in the chest of the frozen world. Another contraction seized her, a tidal wave of agony that stole her breath and tightened its fist around her spine. She bit down on a strip of leather, the taste of it filling her mouth as her knuckles turned white, gripping the edge of a wooden crate. Liam should have been here. He'd left for Redemption Gulch 6 days ago, a 3-day ride at most, to file the final deed on this patch of unforgiving Montana land and buy the last of the supplies they'd need to survive the winter. His smile as he kissed her goodbye had been full of promise, of the future they were building, board by painful board. The promise was a lie. The hope was dead. She had felt it on the 4th day, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. The blizzard had descended on the 5th day, sealing her fate. Now, on the 6th, she knew with a certainty that defied reason and clung to the soul that Liam was not coming back. He was gone, swallowed by the same vast, indifferent wilderness that was now trying to swallow her. But she was not alone. The realization sent another jolt through her, one of fear mixed with a ferocious, primal urgency. She pushed, gritting her teeth until she felt her jaw would crack. The world narrowed to the roaring in her ears, the burning in her belly, and the single desperate thought, live. For hours she fought, a lone soldier in a war against nature and her own body. The blizzard raged on, a timeless, unending assault, and inside her tiny, besieged fortress, Alara fought her own battle, pushing and screaming into the heart of the storm until, with a final, soul-shattering cry, the battle was won. A new sound joined the tempest, a thin, reedy wail, fragile and yet impossibly defiant. A baby's cry. Tears streamed down Alara's face, freezing almost instantly on her cheeks. With trembling, clumsy hands, she drew the infant to her chest. A girl, her daughter. She was slick and small and perfect, her tiny face contorted in a cry against the injustice of being born into such a cold, cruel world. Alara tore a strip from her own wool petticoat, the last dry piece of cloth she owned, and wrapped the baby tightly, tucking her against her skin for warmth. "Aurora," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. She named her for the dawn, a desperate prayer for a son she no longer believed they would ever see. Exhaustion, absolute and crushing, finally claimed her. The candle guttered and died. The last ember in the hearth winked out. Plunged into a darkness as complete as the inside of a coffin, Alara curled her body around the precious, warm bundle against her chest and surrendered to the cold, her last conscious act a mother's shield against the encroaching frost. The wind screamed its victory. Silas Rourke moved through the blizzard like a ghost, a creature born of the snow and the hard granite of the mountains. The wind that tore at lesser men was merely an old, ill-tempered acquaintance to him. He was checking his northern traplines, a grim ritual in a storm that meant most creatures were holed up and hiding. It was more habit than hope, a way to impose a routine on a world that thrived on chaos. His beard was a solid mass of ice, and his breath plumed in front of him, instantly snatched away by the gale. He was about to turn back toward his own secluded cabin, nestled deep in a protective clutch of pines, when he saw it. A wisp. Not smoke exactly, more like a faint disturbance in the driving snow, a suggestion of warmth where none should be. He squinted, his eyes sharp from decades of scanning horizons for the flicker of an ear or the twitch of a tail. It was the Vance place. The newcomer, the farmer from back east who thought you could tame this land with a plow and a prayer. Silas had seen him once, months ago, and thought him a fool. This country didn't get tamed. It did the taming. He figured the cabin was empty, the farmer having had the good sense to flee to town before the storm hit. Still, something nagged at him. He trudged closer, his snowshoes making a soft whump, whump, whump against the deepening drifts. The cabin was nearly buried, a white mound against a white world. It looked dead, but as he drew near the door, he heard it. Faint, almost imperceptible beneath the roar of the wind. A sound that did not belong here. He stopped, head cocked, listening with an intensity that was part of his hunter's DNA. There it was again. A thin, desperate cry, a baby. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, cut through him. He moved with a sudden, shocking speed, shouldering his long rifle and using the butt to batter away the impacted snow from the door. It was frozen shut. He threw his full weight against it. The wood groaned. He slammed into it again, a feral grunt escaping his lips. The latch, brittle with frost, snapped, and the door flew inward, revealing a scene of absolute blackness and a cold so profound it felt like a physical presence. He stepped inside, his eyes adjusting slowly. The stench of blood and fear hit him first. Then he saw them. A woman, pale as the snow, curled on the floor, a tiny bundle clutched to her chest. They were terrifyingly still. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought he was too late. Then the bundle moved, and the faintest whimper reached his ears. Without a word, Silas slid the pack from his shoulders. He worked with the silent, practiced efficiency of a man whose life depended on his hands. He cleared the hearth, used his flint and steel to coax a spark onto a piece of dry tinder. He carried in an oilskin pouch and fed the fledgling flame with kindling from his pack until a proper fire roared to life, pushing back the shadows and the deadly cold. He filled a small pot with snow and set it to melt by the fire. He found a stiff, frozen blanket and hung it over the broken door. Only then did he approach the woman. He knelt, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he felt her neck for a pulse. It was there, a faint, thready flutter. She was alive. Both of them were. He looked at her face, her features drawn and gaunt, and at the fierce, protective way her arm was locked around her child, even in the depths of unconsciousness. He had seen that look before, a lifetime ago, in another place, on another face. The memory was a fresh stab in an old wound. He pushed it down, back into the cold, dark place where he kept such things. There was work to do. Alara woke to warmth. It was the first thing she registered, a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to be pulling her up from the bottom of a frozen lake. The second was the smell of pine smoke and brewing tea. She opened her eyes. She was not in her cabin. This room was smaller, sturdier, the logs chinked so tightly not a whisper of wind could enter. A fire crackled merrily in a stone hearth. She was lying on a cot, tucked under a heavy buffalo robe. Across the small room, a man sat with his back to her, tending to something over the fire. He was a mountain of a man, dressed in buckskins, with a wild mane of dark, gray-streaked hair and a beard to match. He was the figure from her fevered dreams, the phantom she'd thought a hallucination. Her hand flew to her chest. Empty. A strangled cry escaped her lips. "My baby!" The man turned, his movements slow and deliberate. His face was weathered, carved by wind and sun, his eyes a startlingly clear blue. He nodded toward a small, makeshift cradle set near the hearth. "She's fine, ma'am. Fed her some warmed goat's milk I had. She's sleepin'." Alara scrambled from the cot, a wave of dizziness washing over her. She stumbled to the cradle and peered inside. There, sleeping soundly, was Aurora, her tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Relief so profound it was painful washed through Alara, leaving her weak. She sank to her knees, her hand resting on the edge of the cradle. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Name's Silas," the man said, his voice a low rumble. "Found you in that cabin. You were near froze." She looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time. He was intimidating, but there was no malice in his eyes, only a deep, abiding weariness. "You saved us." He just grunted in response, turning back to the fire. "Was on my way. Your husband around?" The question was a physical blow. "His name was Liam," she said, the words tasting like ash. "He went to town. To Redemption Gulch, to file the deed. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire. Silas didn't turn, but his shoulders seemed to tense. Redemption Gulch, he repeated, the name sounding like a curse on his lips. How long ago? 6 days? He finally looked over his shoulder at her, his expression grim. The storm's been going for 2. He should have been back before it hit. He didn't need to say more. The unspoken words hung in the air. No one survives a storm like this caught out in the open. Alara felt the tears welling up again, hot and bitter. She fought them back. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Not now. She looked at Aurora, a tiny, perfect life dependent entirely on her. Her grief was a luxury she did not have. Silas watched her, his gaze lingering on the baby. For a fleeting instant, the hard mask on his face softened, replaced by a deep, ancient sorrow. It was a look of shared loss, a flicker of understanding that passed between them without a word. He quickly looked away, his gruff demeanor snapping back into place like a shield. Once this storm breaks, we'll go to town, he said, his tone final. You need a doctor, and you need to talk to the sheriff. The storm broke 2 days later, leaving behind a world of stunning, silent beauty and treacherous cold. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the sun glittered off a landscape buried under 4 feet of fresh snow. Silas had fashioned a crude harness for his horse and hitched it to a sledge he'd built for hauling pelts. He bundled Alara and Aurora in every spare fur and blanket he owned, until they were a mound of warmth in the back. The journey was slow and cold. Alara held Aurora tight, the baby's warmth a small comfort against the vast, indifferent wilderness. For the first time, she saw the land not as a place of opportunity, but as a beautiful, deadly predator that had already claimed her husband. Redemption Gulch wasn't a town so much as a wound on the landscape. A single wide street of churned mud, now frozen into treacherous ruts, was lined with a collection of drab, false-fronted buildings. It stank of wet wood, manure, and desperation. As Silas guided the sledge down the main street, faces appeared in windows, and men stopped what they were doing to stare. They stared at Silas, the wild mountain man, with a mixture of fear and contempt. They stared at Alara, the pale, haunted-looking woman, with open curiosity. And they stared at the tiny bundle in her arms. The sheriff's office was a small, grimy building, slumped between the assayer's office and the livery. The sign was faded, the letters barely legible. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale cigar smoke and cheap whiskey. Sheriff Brody sat with his boots up on a cluttered desk, a portly man in his late 50s with a florid face and eyes that had long since given up. He listened to Alara's story with undisguised boredom, cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a Bowie knife. Liam Vance, Brody said, scratching his whiskered chin. Yeah, I remember him. Big fella, full of plans. He leaned back in his chair, which groaned in protest. Look, Mrs. Vance, men go missing out here all the time. He likely got turned around in the snow, or maybe he just kept on riding. Found a warmer climate, if you take my meaning. He would not do that, Alara said, her voice tight with indignation. He was coming back to me. To us. She gestured with her head toward the sleeping Aurora. Brody sighed, a long put-upon sound. There's nothing I can do. We can't send a posse out to search the whole damn territory for one man who probably don't want to be found. He's officially missing. If he turns up, he turns up. If he don't... He shrugged, a gesture of final, bureaucratic indifference. I'm sorry for your trouble, ma'am, truly. Now, if you'll excuse me. He picked up a well-worn dime novel and pointedly opened it. Dismissed. Alara stood there for a moment, stunned by the callousness, the utter lack of concern. A cold knot of fury began to form in her stomach. This wasn't right. She felt it in her bones. She turned and walked out, the sheriff not even bothering to look up. Alara stepped out into the biting wind, feeling more alone than she had in the heart of the blizzard. The cold reality of her situation was settling in. She was a widow, a new mother, penniless, and stranded in a town that clearly didn't care if she lived or died. A difficult conversation, I imagine. The voice was smooth, cultured, and startlingly close. She turned to see a man standing by the boardwalk post, impeccably dressed in a tailored wool coat and a fine felt hat. He was handsome, in a severe way, with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes the color of a winter sky. He smiled, a practiced, charming expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Bartholomew Thorne," he said, tipping his hat. "I own a few of the establishments here in town. I couldn't help but overhear your plight." Alara clutched Aurora tighter, instinctively wary. "I was just reporting my husband missing." "Of course," Thorne said, his voice dripping with a sympathy that felt oily and false. "Liam Vance. A terrible tragedy. He was a dreamer, your husband. A good man, but this land, it chews up dreamers and spits them out." He took a step closer, his gaze falling on the bundle in her arms. "And now you are left with the consequences." He let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "I knew Liam. In fact, we had a brief business discussion before he left. He was worried about you, about providing. He mentioned, should anything happen to him, that he'd want you taken care of." This was a lie. Liam had despised the man, calling him a spider who owned half the town and wanted the other half. "I am a man of business, Mrs. Vance," Thorne went on, his tone shifting to one of magnanimous charity. "But I am not without a heart. That little homestead of yours, it is worthless without a man to work it. A death trap, as you've unfortunately discovered. I will take the deed off your hands, pay you a fair price, enough to get you and the little one on a stagecoach back east where you belong." His fair price was an insult, a fraction of what the land and half-built cabin were worth. It was a vulture's offer. "No," Alara said, her voice quiet but firm. "The land is not for sale." Thorne's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of something cold and hard passed through his eyes. The charm evaporated, leaving behind a chilling menace. "A woman alone with a child. This is a hard country, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice now a soft purr. "A very hard country for those without protection. Think on my offer. It won't stand forever." He tipped his hat again and turned, walking away with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned the ground he walked on. Across the street, half hidden in the shadows of the livery, Silas Rourke watched him go. His hand was resting on the handle of the woodsman's axe tucked into his belt, his knuckles white. He knew Bartholomew Thorne, and he knew with chilling certainty that Alara Vance's troubles were only just beginning. The first door was slammed in her face. The second owner, a nervous man at the general store, mumbled something about not having any work before she could even finish her sentence. At the smithy, the blacksmith wouldn't meet her eyes, his hammer falling with sudden, furious intensity on a piece of glowing iron as he grunted that his wife did all the books. Everywhere Alara went, she was met with the same polite but firm rejection, the same shifty-eyed avoidance. She could feel Thorne's influence like a poison in the town's water supply. Defeated, she found the only place that would take her, a dilapidated boarding house on the edge of town, run by a gaunt, weary woman named Mrs. Gable. The place smelled of boiled cabbage and despair, but the room was cheap and the door had a lock. It would have to do. In the evenings, she would sit in the dim, shared parlor, mending her one spare dress while Aurora slept, and she would listen. The town whispered. The whispers told the real stories that Sheriff Brody's reports left out. They spoke of a rancher who'd challenged Thorne over water rights and had been found at the bottom of a canyon with a broken neck. His death ruled an accident. They spoke of a miner who'd struck a silver claim Thorne wanted, only to have his assay report lost, and his claim jumped by Thorne's men. One evening, a grizzled old man with a cough that shook his entire frame sat down across from her. His name, he eventually offered, was Jedediah Kane. He'd been a prospector, he said, before his luck and his lungs gave out. He saw her watching the street where Thorne's opulent saloon, the Palace, spilled light and raucous noise into the darkness. "Don't stare too long at a spider's web," Jedediah rasped, his voice thick with contempt. "He'll think you're a fly worth catching." He hawked and spat a glob of phlegm into a brass spittoon. "I knew a man once. Had a partner. Thorne was his name. Ambitious even then. My friend ended up dead. and Thorne ended up with a deed to the richest claim in these parts. Funny how that works. He looked at Alara, his eyes sharp and knowing. This town ain't called redemption for the sinners. It's for the property he redeems from other folks' dead hands. You watch yourself, girl. That man's shadow is long and cold. Bartholomew Thorne's campaign began not with a bang, but with 1,000 tiny cuts. He was too smart for open aggression, preferring the slow, suffocating pressure of a python. When Alara went to the general store, the price of flour and milk had doubled, just for her. The owner, Mr. Henderson, wrung his hands and stammered about supply costs, his eyes darting nervously toward the street, as if Thorne himself might be watching. A week later, Mrs. Gable, the boarding house owner, appeared at her door, her face pale and pinched. "I'm sorry, dearie," she whispered, twisting her apron in her hands. "Mr. Thorne's bank holds the note on this place. He suggested it might be best if my rooms were occupied by paying customers." She couldn't bring herself to say more, but the message was clear. Get out. Thorne's men, a trio of surly, swaggering thugs, made a point of being wherever she was. They wouldn't touch her, not directly. They'd simply block her path on the boardwalk, forcing her into the muddy street. They'd sit at a nearby table in the eatery, talking loudly about the high mortality rate of infants in the territory. One afternoon, a clod of mud spattered against her dress, thrown by a boy who immediately ran and hid behind the legs of one of the thugs, who grinned wolfishly at her. It was psychological warfare designed to isolate and terrify her, to make her feel so unwelcome and unsafe that his paltry offer for her land would begin to look like salvation. She swallowed her pride and went back to Sheriff Brody. She detailed the harassment, the price gouging, the veiled threats. Brody listened with an air of profound irritation, polishing a silver badge that was the only clean thing in his office. "Mrs. Vance," he said, sighing heavily, "this is a frontier town. People are rough, boys throw mud, prices fluctuate. You are being hysterical." He leaned forward, his expression turning sly. "You know, all this trouble would likely go away if you weren't so stubborn. I hear Mr. Thorne made you a very generous offer. A smart woman would have taken it." The blatant, galling injustice of it all stole her breath. He wasn't just failing to do his job, he was an active participant in her persecution. She looked at the man who was meant to represent the law and saw only Thorne's puppet. There was no help to be found here. None at all. The hatred for both men, cold and pure, settled deep in her heart. Silas did not come into town often. It was a place of noise and bad memories. But he found excuses. A need for salt, for new traps, for ammunition he didn't really need. He'd see Alara from a distance, her shoulders squared, her chin held high as she navigated the hostile streets, and a quiet, protective anger would stir in him. He began to fight Thorne's war of whispers with his own war of silence. One morning, Alara opened her door to find a brace of plump rabbits lying on the step, freshly dressed. The next day, a small bundle of firewood, dry and perfectly split, was stacked neatly outside. She never saw him leave them, but she knew who it was. When Thorne's thugs tried to corner her near the livery, Silas seemed to materialize from the shadows of the alley. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, his immense frame blocking their path, his hand resting on his axe handle. The thugs, full of bravado when tormenting a lone woman, suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. He would then melt back into the shadows, but his presence lingered. He started escorting her in his own way. If she had to go to the store, he would be across the street, leaning against a post, ostensibly cleaning his rifle, but his eyes missing nothing. It was a silent, imposing declaration that she was not entirely alone. One evening, he found her struggling to fix the loose, rattling lock on her boarding house door. He took the tools from her hands without a word, and, with a few deft movements, had the lock reset, solid and secure. "Thank you, Silas," she said, her voice soft. He grunted, testing the lock. "A good lock is a start. It's the men you have to worry about." "Why are you helping me?" she asked, the question she'd wanted to ask for weeks. He stopped his work and looked at her, his blue eyes holding a profound sadness. "I had a wife once," he said, his voice low and rough with disuse. "And a daughter. Little Sarah. She had hair the color of corn silk. He stared at a point over her shoulder, seeing a ghost from his past. Spotted fever took them both in the space of a week. This land, it takes. It doesn't ask. Sometimes, a man's got to try and push back. He didn't say more, but in that moment of shared grief, Alara understood him. He wasn't just protecting her, he was standing guard for the family he had already lost. Thorn was not a patient man. His subtle pressures were not working fast enough. Alara's stubborn refusal to break and the silent, imposing presence of the mountain man grated on his sense of absolute control. He decided it was time to raise the stakes. The smell of smoke woke Alara from a light, fretful sleep. It was acrid and thick, catching in the back of her throat. Panic, cold and immediate, seized her. She snatched Aurora from her cradle, the baby stirring and beginning to cry. Smoke was curling under the door of her room. The boarding house was on fire. She threw a blanket over the baby and herself and stumbled to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. But before she could turn the handle, she heard a crash from downstairs, followed by a muffled shout and the sickening wet thud of an axe striking flesh and bone. Outside, Silas had been watching. He'd seen two of Thorne's most notorious thugs, the Miller brothers, skulking near the back of the boarding house with a can of lamp oil. He'd circled around in the darkness, moving with the silence of a hunting cat. He'd watched them splash the oil on the dry wooden porch and touch a match to it. As the flames licked up the wall, he acted. He didn't shout a warning, he didn't fire his gun. This was close, dirty work. He burst from the alley like an avenging spirit. The first brother turned, his face a mask of shock, just as the flat of Silas's axe caught him square in the temple. He went down without a sound. The second brother, younger and faster, spun around, pulling a knife. He lunged, and Silas met him. It wasn't a clean fight. It was a desperate, grunting brawl in the flickering, hellish light of the growing fire. The thug was wiry and quick, his knife darting in and out like a snake's tongue. It sliced across Silas's forearm, drawing a line of fire. Silas ignored the pain, his focus absolute. He parried another thrust, grabbed the man's wrist, and twisted until the bones snapped with an audible crack. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony. Silas didn't hesitate. He drove his fist into the man's throat, silencing him for good. Just as the other boarders began to shout and doors began to open, Silas faded back into the night, leaving two broken men twitching on the ground amidst the smoldering remains of the porch fire, which was already being doused with buckets of water. From her second-story window, Alara had seen it all. The brutal, terrifying efficiency of the fight, the stark reality of what Thorne was willing to do, and the realization, cold and hard as steel, that her life and her daughter's life depended on more than just stubbornness and the kindness of a stranger. If she was going to survive, she would have to learn to fight back. Silas slipped back into her room through the window, before the commotion outside had fully died down. He was breathing heavily, and a dark stain was spreading on his buckskin sleeve. Alara was already there with a basin of water and strips of cloth torn from a bedsheet. She said nothing, simply motioned for him to sit. Her hands, he noticed, were perfectly steady as she cleaned and bound the gash on his arm. The woman who had been terrified of a slamming door just weeks ago was now tending to a battle wound without a tremor. "They won't stop," she said, her voice flat, devoid of fear or panic. It was a simple statement of fact. "No," Silas agreed, his voice a low growl. "Thorne won't stop until he has what he wants, or until he's put in the ground." They sat in silence for a long time, the shouts outside fading as the fire was extinguished, and the townsfolk dispersed, muttering about drunkards and accidents. The air in the small room was thick with unspoken truths. Finally, Alara looked up from his bandaged arm, her eyes meeting his. They were no longer the eyes of a frightened victim. They were hard, like chips of flint, and they held a fire that matched the one that had just been set outside her door. "Teach me," she said. Silas looked at her, confused. "Teach you what?" "How to shoot," she said, her voice unwavering. "How to use a gun. How to stop being the rabbit and start being the wolf." He saw the absolute resolve in her face, the fierce maternal determination that had allowed her to survive the blizzard. He had seen men, hardened soldiers and frontiersmen, who possessed less steel than this woman held in her gaze. He was hesitant, not because he doubted her, but because he knew what that path meant. It was a path of violence and blood, a path from which there was no turning back. He looked over at Aurora, sleeping peacefully in her cradle, oblivious to the night's horrors. He was not just teaching a woman to shoot, he was arming a mother bear. He let out a long, slow breath. He reached for the Colt Peacemaker tucked into his belt, the metal dark and heavy. He checked that it was unloaded, then held it out to her, butt first. "First lesson," he said, his voice grim. "Never point it at anything you don't intend to kill." Alara took the revolver. Its weight in her hand was terrifying, immense, but it was also solid, real. It was the weight of a choice, the weight of survival. As her fingers closed around the cold, checkered grip, she made a silent vow. She would no longer be the hunted. The canyon was 5 miles out of town, a secluded gash in the earth walled by stone and scrub pine, where the sound of a gunshot would be swallowed by the vastness of the landscape. This became Alara's classroom. Her instructor was a harsh one. Silas had no patience for wasted movements or foolish questions. "The gun is a tool," he'd grunted, slapping the revolver into her palm on the first day. "Like a hammer or an axe, respect it, don't fear it." The first time she fired the Colt, the recoil slammed her wrist back, and the explosion deafened her for a moment. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt 10 feet to the left of the tin can Silas had set on a rock. Her hand tingled, her ears rang, and the smell of sulfur and burnt powder filled her nostrils. "Again," was all Silas said. Day after day, they returned to the canyon. Her hands, once soft from kneading dough and stitching quilts, became raw, then calloused. A small blister formed on the pad of her thumb from cocking the heavy hammer. Her shoulder ached. But she never complained. She channeled her grief for Liam and her terror for Aurora into a singular, cold focus. She learned to control her breathing, to let it out slow and steady before squeezing the trigger, not pulling it. She learned to stand, feet planted, absorbing the kick of the weapon. Silas made her practice reloading until she could do it in the dark, her fingers finding the cartridges and the loading gate by feel alone. He'd throw rocks into the bushes nearby, forcing her to turn and aim at the sound, training her instincts. "Aim for the chest," he instructed, his voice flat. "It's the biggest target. A gut shot is slow and ugly. A head shot is for fancy Dans and fools. You ain't either. You're a survivor. You shoot to stop the threat. Nothing else." Slowly, she improved. The wild shots became less frequent. The tin can started to jump. Then, one afternoon, after a week of relentless practice, she fired 6 shots in quick succession. 6 resounding pings echoed through the canyon as each bullet found its mark, sending the can dancing and spinning off the rock. She lowered the smoking revolver, her arms steady, her breathing controlled. She looked at Silas. For the first time, a flicker of something akin to a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Good," he said. It was the highest praise she had ever received. She was no longer just a mother. She was a woman with a gun, and she knew how to use it. Being able to shoot was one thing. Knowing when and where to shoot was another. Alara needed information. She needed to get inside Thorne's world, and there was only one way to do that. She waited until dusk, then walked with a purpose she did not feel toward the swinging doors of Thorne's palace. The saloon was a cacophony of loud laughter, bad piano music, and the clinking of glasses. The air was thick with stale beer and desperation. She ignored the leering stares of the patrons and made her way to the bar. Maria was there, wiping down the counter with a rag. She was a woman who looked older than her years, with hard, knowing eyes and a cynical twist to her lips. She saw Alara, and her expression soured. "We don't serve your kind in here, ma'am. Best you move on." "I'm not here for a drink," Alara said, her voice low. She slid a silver dollar across the wet bar, one of the last she had. "I'm here for a moment of your time, away from here." Maria's eyes flickered to the coin, then back to Alara's face. She saw the desperation, but also the steel beneath it. She hesitated, then glanced toward Thorne's office at the top of the stairs. 5 minutes, in the alley out back, and don't be late." In the cold, dark alley, with the saloon's noise a dull roar behind them, Alara laid it out. "I know Thorn is responsible for what's happening to me. I think he's responsible for my husband's death." Maria laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You think? Honey, the sky is blue, water is wet, and Bart Thorn is a snake. That ain't news." "I need proof," Alara pressed. "You see things, you hear things. Anything. About my husband, Liam. About the men he uses." Maria's cynical mask cracked for a moment. She looked at Alara, at her plain, patched dress and her determined face, and saw a reflection of her own trapped existence. She hated Thorn, hated him for the way he looked at her, for the way he owned her and everyone else in this town. Helping this woman was a risk, a terrible risk, but it was also a chance, however small, to strike back. "Your husband," Maria said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He came to see Thorn the day he disappeared. They argued, loudly. I heard Thorn shouting about a survey map and calling your husband a thief. Later that day, Thorn sent the Miller brothers out. Said they were checking on a land dispute. The Millers are Thorn's private dogs. They do the things he don't want his name on. They came back 2 days later, and Liam Vance never did." She paused, her gaze intense. "That's all I know. And if you tell anyone I told you, I'm a dead woman. Now take your coin and get out of here." Maria slipped back into the saloon, leaving Alara in the darkness with the first concrete piece of the puzzle. It wasn't proof, not yet. But it was a trail. And it led directly back to Bartholomew Thorn. Thorn saw the change in Alara. The fear in her eyes was being replaced by something else. Something he didn't like. And the trapper was always lurking, a silent, watchful threat. He decided it was time to remove the Queen's most powerful piece from the board. The plan was simple, elegant in its cruelty. Thorn's men rode out to the Cross Creek Ranch 10 miles south, and under the cover of darkness stole a prize stallion, a horse known throughout the county for its distinctive white blaze. They led it back to Silas's secluded cabin, tethered it out of sight in the woods, and planted a Cross Creek branding iron, stolen from the ranch's forge, in the back of Silas's sledge, tucking it under a pile of furs. The next morning, an anonymous and concerned citizen rode into Redemption Gulch and informed Sheriff Brody that he'd seen a man, matching Silas Rourke's description, riding the stolen horse toward the northern woods. Brody, who owed Thorn more in gambling debts than he could earn in a decade, practically salivated at the chance to get rid of the troublesome mountain man and please his patron at the same time. He gathered a posse of 6 men, deputizing a few of Thorn's own thugs for good measure. Alara saw them ride out, a grim procession heading north. A cold dread washed over her. She ran to the livery, hired a horse she couldn't afford, and rode like the devil was on her heels, praying she wasn't too late. She arrived at Silas's cabin to see him standing with his hands bound, surrounded by Brody's posse. Brody was holding up the branding iron with a theatrical flourish. "Silas Rourke," Brody declared, his voice full of false authority. "I'm arresting you for the theft of a horse from the Cross Creek Ranch. We found the animal tethered not 100 yards from here." "It's a frame-up, Brody, and you know it," Silas growled, his eyes blazing with contempt. "He's innocent," Alara cried, dismounting and rushing forward. "Thorn did this! He's trying to get rid of him!" Brody sneered at her. "Now why would a respected man like Mr. Thorn do that? Rourke here is a known loner, a man who lives outside the law. It fits." He gestured to his men. "Take him away. He'll have his trial before the circuit judge arrives. And I reckon he'll hang." The posse dragged the struggling Silas away. He looked back at Alara, his face a mask of fury and helplessness. She was left standing there in the snow, watching them take her only friend, her only protector. The noose Thorn was tightening had just been pulled viciously taut. She was well and truly alone. The jail was a stone box with barred windows, as cold and unforgiving as the justice it dispensed. Silas was inside and Alara was outside, powerless. The trial was a foregone conclusion. A sham. 2 days later, Thorn came to her. He didn't send one of his men. He came himself, knocking on the door of her small room at the boarding house. He was holding an official-looking document, an eviction notice. Mrs. Gable, Thorne explained with a predatory smile, had defaulted on her loan. The bank, his bank, was foreclosing. Alara had 24 hours to vacate the premises. He let the news sink in, watching her face pale. Then he made his final move. "This does not have to be so difficult, Alara," he said, using her first name for the first time. An act of repulsive intimacy. He slid another document from his coat. The deed to her land. "I am a reasonable man. Sign this over to me and your troubles disappear." She stared at him, her heart a block of ice in her chest. "Think of it," he purred, his voice a venomous whisper. "I have a word with Sheriff Brody. He misplaces the evidence against your friend the trapper. The circuit judge arrives. The case is dismissed for lack of proof. Rourke is banished from the territory, but he lives. You get a coach ticket and enough money to start fresh somewhere else. A clean break." He paused, his eyes flicking to the cradle where Aurora slept. His smile widened. "The alternative, Nai, is not so pleasant. You out in the cold with a baby. And your friend Silas. Well, horse thieves have a short rope and a long drop in this country." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, his breath foul with the scent of expensive cigars. "It would be a terrible shame for a child to grow up without a mother or a father figure." The threat was naked, brutal, and absolute. He had her. He had stripped away her protector, her home, her hope. He had backed her into a corner with no escape. He left the deed and a pen on the small table. "You have until morning to decide." After he left, Alara sank onto the lumpy mattress, her body trembling. She looked at the eviction notice, she looked at the deed, she looked at her sleeping child. Despair, thick and suffocating as mud, threatened to drown her. Thorne had won. He had beaten her. She picked up the pen, her hand shaking uncontrollably. She couldn't do it. Her hand hovered over the deed, the pen trembling, but she couldn't bring herself to sign away the last piece of Liam, the dream they had shared. She let the pen fall. Defeated, she began to pack the few meager belongings she owned. A spare dress, Aurora's swaddling clothes, and Liam's old toolbox. It was heavy, full of tools she didn't know how to use. She ran her hand over the worn wood, a final goodbye to her husband. As she did, her fingers brushed against a small, loose splinter on the bottom. Idly, she picked at it. It wasn't a splinter. It was the edge of a small, cleverly hidden panel. Her heart gave a sudden, sharp thump. With trembling fingers, she worked her nail under the edge and pried it open. Inside was a small, hollowed-out compartment. And inside the compartment was a bundle of oilskin-wrapped papers. Her hands shook as she untied the string. The first document was the real deed to their homestead, the one Liam was supposed to file. But tucked behind it were two other items. One was a folded, brittle piece of paper, a hand-drawn map. It showed the familiar creeks and ridges of her land, but running through the center of it was a thick, snaking line marked with the words Serpent's Tooth. Below it were notes on depth and purity, geological terms she didn't understand but whose meaning was unmistakable. It was a map to a gold strike, a rich one. The last document made her blood run cold. It was a sworn affidavit, the handwriting shaky but clear, signed by a man named Alistair Finch and dated 2 years prior. It was a deathbed confession. "I, Alistair Finch, being of sound mind but failing body, do hereby swear that my partner, Bartholomew Thorne, did willfully and with malice aforethought push me from the ridge at Blackwood Point to steal my half of our shared claim, the Serpent's Tooth. He left me for dead. He does not know I survived long enough for a passing crow hunter to find me. He does not know of this testimony. The map to the claim is with me. I give it now to the man who found me, Liam Vance, a good and honest man who gave a dying man water, in the hope that he can see justice done where I have failed. Thorne is a murderer and a thief. Let God be my witness. It all crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. Thorne hadn't just wanted her land for its value. He'd wanted it because he was terrified of what was hidden there. Liam hadn't just been a farmer who stumbled into a land dispute. He had been carrying the proof that could destroy Bartholomew Thorne, the evidence of the murder that had been the very foundation of his fortune. And Thorne knew it. He had killed Liam to get it, and now she held it in her hands. The despair that had crushed her just moments before evaporated, burned away by a white-hot, righteous rage. This wasn't just about her survival anymore. It was about justice for Liam. It was about vengeance. Thorne had made a fatal mistake. He hadn't just made her a victim. He had made her an heir. The map was more than paper and ink. It was power. The affidavit was more than a confession. It was a weapon. Alara looked at the documents, her mind racing, the fear and despair replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. Thorne thought he had her trapped. He had no idea she was the one holding the key to his cage. Her first stop was not the sheriff's office. It was the smokiest corner of the town's grimiest eatery, where Jedediah Kane nursed a cup of chicory coffee. She sat down opposite him, her presence a silent demand for his attention. "I need your help," she said, her voice low and steady. Jedediah coughed, a dry rattling sound. "Help? Girl, the only person who can help you is the Undertaker, and Thorne owns him too." "Thorne killed my husband," she said, her words sharp and precise, "just like he killed your partner, Alistair Finch." Jedediah froze, his cup halfway to his lips. His watery eyes narrowed, suddenly sharp and sober. "How do you know that name?" he rasped. "Liam found him before he died. He left something behind." She didn't show him the documents. Not yet. Trust was a currency she couldn't afford to spend recklessly. "I have proof, Jedediah. Proof that Thorne is a murderer, and I know where the Serpent's Tooth is." The old prospector's face, a roadmap of past griefs and disappointments, contorted with a mixture of disbelief and a long-dormant hunger for revenge. He stared at her, searching her face for any hint of a lie. He saw none. Only a grim, unshakable resolve. "What do you want from me?" he finally asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Allies," she said. "Men this town has forgotten. Men Thorne has cheated and broken. Men who have nothing left to lose and a score to settle. You know who they are." Jedediah Kane leaned back, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face for the first time since Alara had met him. "Oh, I know 'em," he said, a dangerous glint in his eye. "I know 'em all." The meeting took place in the dead of night, in the cavernous, hay-scented dark of the abandoned livery at the edge of town. Jedediah had brought them. There were only two, but their grievances were as deep as any army's. First was Cole, the blacksmith. A man with shoulders like boulders and hands that could bend iron, whose business had been crippled when Thorne opened a competing smithy and used his influence to steal all the contracts. Cole's anger was a slow-burning fire. Second was Marcus, a rancher whose flock of sheep had been decimated by a mysterious disease after he refused to sell his grazing land to Thorne. He was quiet, his face etched with a permanent sorrow, but his eyes held a steely resolve. Alara stood before them in the lantern light, a lone woman flanked by an old prospector. She laid out the plan, her voice clear and confident. She told them about Silas, framed and facing a hangman's noose. She told them about the affidavit that proved Thorne was a murderer. She told them about the map. "The circuit judge arrives in 3 days for Silas's trial," she explained. "He has a reputation for being an honest man, one Thorne can't buy. We get the affidavit to him, and Thorne is finished." "Easier said than done," Cole, the blacksmith, grumbled. "Thorne's got a dozen hired guns. Brody and his deputy. We're 3 men and a woman." "We'll have Alice," Alara countered. "And we won't fight them head-on. We'll be smarter. We hit them where they don't expect it." The plan was audacious. First, they would break Silas out of jail. He was their best fighter, and his freedom was non-negotiable. Second, they would use the existence of the map to lure Thorne into a public trap, exposing him in front of the entire town and the circuit judge. "He's greedy," Alara said, her eyes glinting in the lamplight. "And he's paranoid. He knows I have the map now. He'll be desperate to get it before the judge arrives. We'll use his own greed as the bait." The 3 men looked at each other. It was a mad plan, a suicide mission. But as they looked at Alara, at the fire in her eyes, they saw not madness, but a chance. A chance for justice. A chance for payback. "All right, ma'am," Marcus the rancher said, his voice quiet but firm. You tell us what to do. Her outcast army was small, but it was forged. The next piece of the puzzle lay behind the swinging doors of the palace. Jedediah, being a familiar and pitiable sight, was the messenger. He shuffled into the saloon, bought a cheap whiskey, and waited for a moment when Maria was alone at the end of the bar. He accidentally dropped a small folded note near her foot as he stumbled away. Later that night, Maria slipped out the back and left her own note under a loose brick in the alley wall. Alara retrieved it under the cover of darkness. Maria's scrawled handwriting was a treasure map of tactical information. Brody gets sloppy drunk by 10 o'clock. Leaves one deputy, a half-wit named Cletus, on guard. Cletus spends most of his time reading penny dreadfuls. Thorne is nervous. He hired 4 new guns. Mean-looking bastards from out of the territory. They're staying in the rooms above the saloon. They patrol the town in pairs after midnight. Be careful. 4 new guns. The odds had just gotten longer. But Maria's information was vital. It gave them a window. A small one, but a window nonetheless. They would have to be fast, quiet, and brutal. Alara knew that a direct assault on the jail, even with Brody drunk, was too risky with Thorne's new men patrolling. She needed an ace in the hole. She needed to turn Thorne's most reliable piece against him. She waited until late afternoon, when the shadows grew long and Sheriff Brody was nursing a hangover in his office. She walked in alone. He looked up, his expression one of weary annoyance. What do you want now, Mrs. Vance? I'm busy. Alara didn't say a word. She walked to his desk and placed a piece of paper on it. It was a painstakingly made copy of Alistair Finch's affidavit. Brody read it. His florid face went pale, the color draining from it until it was the color of old parchment. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with panic. What is this? It's a forgery. A lie. The original is in a very safe place, Alara said, her voice as cold and calm as a frozen river. A place where Thorne can't get to it. And a second copy is addressed to Circuit Judge Morrison, waiting to be delivered the moment he rides into town. Unless... She let the word hang in the air. Brody swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He was trapped. If he helped Thorne, he'd be implicated in a murder conspiracy when the affidavit came out. If he didn't, Thorne would likely kill him for his failure. Alara offered him a third path. I don't want you to fight for us, Sheriff. I just want you to look the other way for 10 minutes. That's all I need. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. When Thorne is gone and the serpent's tooth is mine, a man who finds himself in a position of authority might find a bag of gold dust on his desk one morning. Enough to pay off his debts. Enough to start over, somewhere far away from here. She was offering him not just a way out, but a reward. She was betting on his cowardice and his greed, the very traits that had made him Thorne's puppet. Sheriff Brody stared at the copied affidavit, then at Alara. The flicker of the man he used to be, the man who'd once believed in the badge he wore, warred with the broken, indebted shell he had become. Fear won, but it was fear of Alara and the future she represented, not of Thorne. He didn't speak. He simply opened his desk drawer, pulled out a watch, and said, his voice a strained croak. The new patrols change shifts at 1 in the morning. They meet at the saloon. There's a 5-minute window when the west end of town is clear. He had made his choice. The livery was tense with a coiled spring energy. Weapons were being cleaned by the dim lantern light. Cole the blacksmith was sharpening a heavy meat cleaver, the soft shing-shing-shing of steel on stone, a nervous rhythm in the quiet. Marcus was checking the action on his old Spencer rifle. Jedediah was filling his pockets with shotgun shells. Alara sat on a hay bale, Silas's heavy Colt in her lap. She disassembled it, cleaned each part with an oiled rag, and reassembled it with the practiced efficiency Silas had taught her. The smooth, mechanical clicks were a calming mantra in the chaos of her thoughts. She looked over at the small, makeshift cot in the corner, where Mrs. Gable, the evicted boarding house owner who had secretly joined their cause out of pure hatred for Thorne, was watching over a sleeping Aurora. Alara's heart ached. Everything she was about to do, the violence she was about to unleash, was for that tiny, innocent life. She was risking everything to give her daughter a future free from the shadow of men like Bartholomew Thorne. Jedediah came and sat beside her, his joints cracking as he lowered himself down. He followed her gaze to the sleeping child. "Scared?" he asked quietly. "Terrified," Alara admitted, her voice barely a whisper. The old prospector nodded, his eyes full of a surprising wisdom. "Fear's good," he rasped. "It keeps you alive. Lets you know you got something to lose, just don't let it do the steering." He patted her shoulder, a rare gesture of comfort, and went back to his shotgun. Alara took a deep breath, the smell of hay and gun oil filling her lungs. She picked up the revolver. It felt balanced in her hand now, an extension of her own will. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer in the driver's seat. Tonight, she was. At 12:45 a.m., the night erupted in fire and chaos. Marcus and Jedediah, moving like ghosts through the back alleys, had reached Thorne's stables. They worked quickly, splashing lamp oil on the dry hay bales stacked against the rear wall. Jedediah struck a match, the small flame flaring to life, a tiny star of vengeance in the darkness. He tossed it onto the hay. The result was instantaneous and spectacular. The dry hay went up with a roar, and flames, hungry and orange, leaped up the side of the stable, illuminating the entire east end of town. Horses screamed in terror, their panicked neighs a clarion call of disaster. Men poured out of Thorne's palace, shouting and pointing. Two of the new hired guns, the pair patrolling the east side, immediately sprinted toward the blaze. Thorne himself appeared on the saloon balcony, his face a mask of fury. "It's a fire! Get buckets! Save the horses!" he bellowed. The diversion was working perfectly. The attention of the entire town, including most of Thorne's muscle, was now fixed on the burning stable, a raging bonfire of distraction on the far side of town. While the town was transfixed by the fire, Alara and Cole moved through the deserted western streets. They reached the sheriff's office just as the town clock began its slow, ponderous chime for 1 o'clock. The West Side Patrol was gone, on their way to the saloon for the shift change. The 5-minute window was open. Cole didn't bother with the lock. He lowered his shoulder and hit the door with the force of a battering ram. The wood splintered, the frame cracking as the door flew open. Inside, the deputy, Cletus, looked up from his dime novel, his mouth agape with stupid surprise. Before he could even register what was happening, Cole was on him, a massive hand clamping over his mouth, another twisting the pistol from his holster. Cletus was shoved into an empty cell, and the door slammed shut. Sheriff Brody was there, as promised, sitting at his desk with a bottle of whiskey. He was pale and sweating, but he was sober. He looked at Alara, then deliberately turned his chair to face the wall, his back to the proceedings. He had kept his end of the bargain. Alara grabbed the ring of keys from the wall hook, her hand sure and steady. She found the right one and slid it into the lock of Silas's cell. The tumblers clicked, loud in the tense silence. The door swung open. Silas was on his feet instantly. He had been listening, waiting. He looked from Alara to Cole, taking in the scene. He saw the gun strapped to Alara's thigh, the cold resolve in her eyes. There was no time for thanks, no time for questions. He simply nodded, a look of fierce pride and gratitude passing between them. He strode to the gun rack on the wall and took down a Winchester rifle, its action smooth and familiar in his hands. He was free, and now he was armed. Thorne was no fool. As he watched the disorganized efforts to fight the stable fire, a cold suspicion began to creep into his mind. The fire was too convenient, the timing too perfect. He looked toward the dark, quiet end of town where the jail was. It was a diversion. "Fools, leave the fire!" he roared at his remaining men. "They're at the jail, let's go!" He and his 4 remaining gunslingers, including the 2 who had just arrived from the West End Patrol, abandoned the stables and sprinted down the main street toward the sheriff's office, their boots pounding on the wooden boardwalk. But as they ran, a young boy, the son of the blacksmith Cole, darted out from an alley and thrust a note into Thorne's hand before disappearing back into the darkness. Thorne skidded to a halt, tearing it open. It was Maria's handwriting, but the words were Alara's. "Thorne, I have the map to the Serpent's Tooth. I'm meeting the circuit judge at the assay office to register the claim in my name. You've lost. Greed and panic warred in Thorne's mind. The jailbreak was a problem, but the map was the secret to his entire existence. If Alara registered that claim, the affidavit would surely follow. The circuit judge was due any hour. He had to get that map, now. "Forget the jail," he snarled at his men, his voice cracking with desperation. "She's at the assay office. We get that map, or we're all finished. Move." Consumed by his own avarice, he ran headlong into the real trap. The assay office stood dark and silent at the center of town. As Thorne and his 4 gunmen approached, they saw a lone figure step out from the shadows into the middle of the street. It was Alara. She stood there, bathed in the distant, flickering light of the stable fire, Silas's Colt held loosely at her side. "Looking for this, Bartholomew?" she called out, her voice ringing with a confidence that infuriated him. "You've made a fatal mistake, you stupid girl," Thorne spat, his men fanning out beside him. "Give me the map, and I might let you live." "The time for deals is over," Alara replied, her voice dropping, cold and hard. It was then that Thorne realized his own fatal mistake. A dark figure rose from the rooftop of the general store, the long barrel of a Winchester catching the firelight. To his left, the door of the smithy creaked open, revealing Cole with a shotgun. To his right, Jedediah and Marcus stepped out of an alley, their own weapons leveled. They were surrounded, boxed in. The world exploded. Silas fired first, his rifle shot cracking through the night and sending one of Thorne's men stumbling backward with a hole in his chest. The other gunman reacted instantly, diving for cover and returning fire. The main street of Redemption Gulch became a shooting gallery, a whirlwind of muzzle flashes, roaring guns, and the high-pitched whine of ricocheting bullets. Wood splintered from porch posts, windows shattered. Jedediah's shotgun boomed, a deafening roar that sent a spray of lead into the side of a water trough where a gunman was hiding. Cole laid down, suppressing fire with his shotgun, forcing 2 of the gunmen to stay pinned down. Alara didn't fire wildly. She remembered Silas's lessons. Control your breathing, use cover, make every shot count. She dropped behind an overturned cart as bullets whizzed over her head. She saw one of the gunmen reloading and rose, taking careful aim. She squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked in her hand and the man cried out, clutching his shoulder as he fell. One more down. The fight was a blur of motion and noise, but her focus was absolute. It narrowed down to one man, the man in the fine wool coat who was now scrambling for the cover of his own saloon. Bartholomew Thorne. Alara sprinted across the street, ignoring the chaos of the ongoing gunfight. She saw Thorne stumble through the swinging doors of the palace. She followed him in without hesitation. The grand saloon was a wreck. Tables were overturned, glass was shattered, blown. Thorne was behind the long mahogany bar, fumbling to reload his pistol. He saw her enter and fired, the shot going wild and smashing a large mirror behind her, sending a shower of glass cascading to the floor. Alara fired back, her own shot deliberate and aimed. The bullet tore through Thorne's arm, and he cried out in pain, dropping his pistol. She advanced on him, her own gun steady. "It's over, Thorne," she said, her voice echoing in the ruined saloon. "Your lies are buried. Your empire is burning." In a final, cowardly act, Thorne lunged and grabbed Maria, who had been hiding behind the bar. He dragged her in front of him, her body a human shield, a shard of broken bottle held to her throat. "Stay back!" he screamed, his eyes wild with terror. "I'll kill her, I swear I will." Alara froze. She couldn't risk a shot. For a moment it seemed he had found one last way to win, but she saw the look in Maria's eyes. Not fear. Pure, unadulterated hatred. Alara locked eyes with Thorne. "You're a coward, Bartholomew," she taunted, taking a slow step forward. "You built everything you have on the bodies of better men. You killed my husband. You killed Alistair Finch. But you couldn't even do it to their faces, could you? You left them to die in the dark." His focus wavered, his rage stoked by her words. In that split second of distraction, Maria acted. She stomped down hard on Thorne's instep with her heel and drove her elbow backward into his ribs with all her might. Thorne roared in pain, his grip loosening for an instant. He shoved Maria away from him, raising the bloody shard of glass to strike. That was the only opening Alara needed. Her gun was already aimed. Her mind was clear. She saw not the man, but the center of the target. She squeezed the trigger. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Bartholomew Thorne jerked back as if struck by an invisible fist. A look of profound surprise crossed his face. He stumbled backward, clawed at the bar for a moment, and then collapsed behind it, a final rattling sigh escaping his lips. He was dead. Silence descended, broken only by the sound of Alara's own ragged breathing. The shooting outside had stopped. As the smoke cleared, the sound of hoofbeats and carriage wheels reached them. A coach, bearing the official seal of the territorial court, was rolling to a stop outside. The circuit judge had arrived. On the saloon steps, Sheriff Brody, his face a mask of grim resignation, stood waiting. In his trembling hand, he clutched a familiar-looking piece of paper. He was ready to confess everything. 1 month later, spring arrived in the high country. The thaw came slowly at first, then, all at once, a great sigh of relief from the land itself. The oppressive weight of the snow melted away, revealing the tender, green shoots of new life beneath. The creeks, choked with ice for months, now ran fast and clear. The town of Redemption Gulch was thawing, too. With Thorne dead and his criminal enterprise exposed by Brody's full confession to the incorruptible Judge Morrison, the fear that had held the town in its grip for years finally broke. Thorne's assets were seized by the court. His hired guns were either dead or had fled. The town was learning to breathe again. Jedediah, Cole, and Marcus were now partners, working the Serpent's Tooth claim under a legal charter from the court. Their first haul had been modest, but it was theirs, earned with sweat and courage. They were rebuilding their lives, just as the town was rebuilding its soul. Alara Vance stood on the porch of her finished homestead. The cabin was small but sturdy, the gaps in the logs now properly chinked, the roof solid against the sky. The scent of fresh-cut pine hung in the air. This was her land now, the deed filed and secure, her ownership absolute. At her feet, Aurora lay on a soft blanket, cooing at the vast blue sky, her tiny hands reaching for the warmth of the sun. A horse approached, and Alara didn't startle. She knew the sound of that steady, unhurried gait. Silas Rourke dismounted, tethering his horse to the porch rail. He'd been cleared of all charges, of course, and had spent the last few weeks helping Alara and the others rebuild. He hadn't returned to his isolated cabin in the mountains. He didn't say much. He never did. He just picked up a hammer and began securing a loose board on the porch, his movements comfortable and familiar. They worked in a companionable silence, a language of shared experience that needed no words. After a while, he stopped and looked out over the valley, a panorama of greening hills and distant snow-capped peaks. "You staying?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Alara looked at the cabin, her home. She looked at Aurora, her future. She looked at the wide, open land that had tried to kill her, the land she had fought for and won. She was no longer the frightened woman from the east. The frontier hadn't broken her, it had forged her. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. "We're home," she said,